Hi guys, it's Ian here. Thanks for listening in, and today we're going to be doing another book review, and today we're looking at Better Driving from the DVSA. This book actually was bought for me for Christmas last year, and just had a chance to look through it. Initially I was quite disappointed when I first read through the book, although there were sections which were quite helpful. But I've reread the book or scanned it recently, and there are some good sections of it. I suppose it's more the way it's been put over and its sort of audience. So I'll explain that a little bit more. But thanks for tuning in anyway. So I'm going to go through a few points inside the book. The first point really is that I'm surprised that the techniques and suggestions inside the book haven't been integrated into other books, but I suppose this is designed at improving your driving after you've passed your driving test and beyond, and maybe a bit of reflection on your own driving. So that's what it's designed for. So I suppose that might be the reason why it's a separate book. It also seems a bit odd to me, and I'm sure there's an explanation behind it, but it's aimed at car drivers. The more you read through, the more you sort of suggest this may be very useful for all road users. So that seemed a little bit odd to me. The most fantastic thing about the book is the sort of contributions from Lisa Dawn. She specialises in essentially psychology around the driving subject, and some of the insights in here are quite useful, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. So one of the things it talks about is the difference between skills and behaviour, which I think is a very important element of driving. My sort of experience shows that a lot of drivers, driving instructors, riders, road users tend to focus in more on the skills of the ability to use the controls and to be able to drive, as opposed to their behaviour around it. So they might be really good at using the clutch, the brakes, accelerator, the gears, steering. They might be fantastic at doing all those things, and they may be able to employ the sort of techniques in which maybe advanced drivers apply all the way through their career. However, their behaviours are not necessarily compliant with that, in terms of maybe they get frustrated at things or and things like that. So in terms of behaviour, that's an important part of this book, which I think is fantastic, needs talking about a lot more, certainly. And for me, that drives our skills as well. I love the fact this promotes lifelong learning. It's certainly one of my suggestions in terms of top tips to keeping safe on the road is ensuring that we keep up to date with things, that we continue to learn throughout our sort of career on the roads. It talks through a lot of human factors and the way in which those will affect our drives, things like stress and fatigue, things, again, we talked about behaviour and things like that, and our perceptions of those things as well. It's one of the very few books that talks a little bit about defensive driving. What's fantastic, this is a double-edged sword really. It talks very much about avoiding a collision. It talks very much about anticipating situations. Absolutely fantastic, absolutely bloody fantastic. That's exactly what we should be doing. However, it talks very little about the control measures from a skills perspective on how we can do that. Although it does talk a little bit about how we can manage our behaviours. Maybe there could be more towards tips and hints about how we can control that. There are tips and hints on how we can control and manage our behaviours inside the book, but I think there could be more control measures inside there about how we put some of these things into action and how we monitor and improve that. It talks very much about how we process information, and my book's coming out probably in the new year, so that's quite exciting for me, and I'm still finishing that off at the moment. But it talks very much about how we process information, and it's one of the things that we don't do very well when we're behind the wheel, whether we have too much information, or it's low quality, or we're too focused on one thing and another, various different things. So it talks very much about that. It talks about distraction, which is absolutely a problem when we're sort of using the road, when we're driving, when we're riding, or using the road as a pedestrian as well. And again, that's one of the points that I made before about, a lot of this stuff like distraction and taking in information. That applies to a pedestrian crossing the road, it applies to a cyclist, it applies to a motorcycle rider. So I'm very surprised that this has purely gone down the driving route, and I'm sure there's a reason for that, but you know, these techniques and thoughts apply to everything. One of the things I learned from the book was about how we look at junctions and how long we look for. Approximately, we only spend half a second looking at some junctions, which is seems a little bit short to me, but that's a really important skill to have, to make sure we look really well at junctions, because we tend not to be very good at that. Again, it talks very much about feelings, belief and behaviour, and how we give ourselves self-feedback. Again, essential for using the road. You know, if we've made a screw up, you know, how can we improve that, etc. So that's quite an important point of the book. It talks about risk and how our personalities affect the way in which we drive. One thing I found quite interesting about the personality side of things, the book talks about a lot of research, and it also talks a lot about personality. Now, personality testing and that sort of thing is done very much in the HR field a lot. What seems a bit odd to me that the discussions in the book were very much specific along the lines of driving. However, a lot of our personality is reflected in the way in which we drive. So I think there's more to be done there. Maybe we could use some personality testing to work out what type of drivers we are, introverts, extroverts, that type of thing. So quite insightful, quite useful, but maybe there could be a little bit more around about that. It talks a little bit about stress and time management, and it talks about how we drive when we're angry and what affects that, things like our life and other road users. What a really important point is having empathy for the road users, and again, maybe that's something that it could talk about a little bit more inside the book. It does sort of touch on that, but it doesn't really call it empathy, but I think that's quite an important factor. But it does talk about how we do get frustrated with other road users, and a little bit of a matrix on a self-analysis of that, which is fantastic actually. Very useful. This book's very useful if you're a driving instructor, particularly if you're training drivers with lower self-esteem or confidence issues, but also surrounding frustrated drivers and things like that. So that is a useful part of the book. In terms of one of the things it touches on, which I think is really important, is about the areas of new technology. And I think that whether we're a driver, rider, instructor, advanced driver, whether or not we really do keep up to date with technologies. Now, I think that's an interesting sort of strategy, and as a driver, I should be keeping up to date with that. I have done a course actually at Bosch with Bosch and Myra, and that was quite helpful to understand some of the two technologies. And I did a bit of work when I went to Company Car in Action and one of the other fleet conferences recently, where we actually practice using some of the kit, which is absolutely phenomenal. But we should really understand how all this stuff works, some of the limitations of it. But that's a really important point that we really should understand a little bit more. It touches on the shared space concept, where we share responsibility for what we're doing on the road, where pedestrians and cyclists and cars all sort of milled together with no boundaries. That's quite an interesting approach to things, and certainly a new modern way of looking at it. I think it touched on familiar and unfamiliar in the sense of roads, that is, from a driver's or rider's perspective, or pedestrian's perspective, road user, in terms of anxiety and stress, and absolutely that's important. But for me, that's a really important point about familiar and unfamiliar roads. So, okay, so perhaps if you're learning to drive, that's part of the process maybe, you know, dealing with new scenarios and things like that. But once we passed our test, a lot of drivers do a daily commute and they're very, very familiar with specific routes, but maybe there's more we could be doing around about understanding how drivers who are unfamiliar with the road deal with it. I think some of the road infrastructure and engineering and signage isn't necessarily geared up to that. And again, there is a balance between it being too obvious or not. But again, it just touches on that in the book. Perhaps it could do a little bit more. In terms of switching between autonomous and non-autonomous driving, that's a really important part of the book, although maybe it's not so clear. It's towards the back of the book, actually. But it talks a little bit about the human aspect of being, if we have autonomous vehicles, and that aspect of it switching between the autonomous and the non-autonomous situation, and how the transition goes between the two, which is quite a scary transition really. But understanding that as a rider, driver, and at least equally as a third party outside of that situation, it's quite an important point that we're going to have to increasingly understand as we start to use the roads and some of the new vehicles. So very interesting point, and I think we need to have a look in a bit more depth at how we manage that. It talks very much about some of the ways that we can help change our behaviours and some techniques for that. It will be useful, I think, maybe to have some examples. I think that will be quite a useful thing to add to the book, but very good. And a fantastic part at the end, towards the end of the book, it talks about national standards. Now, whether you're an instructor or learning to drive, or even a cyclist, pedestrian, etc., there are national standards for most of those things, and we should really know those off by heart and really well. National standards, by the way, whether you're a driving instructor or learning to drive, essentially there's 5 key aspects to it, which is preparation for you, the vehicle, passenger and journey, and those should be integrated into your driver training sessions. It doesn't matter if you're advanced or not as well, but those should be certainly integrated. And again, that's the same for riders as well. But also how to guide and control the vehicle, which is an important aspect. For me personally, I believe we should find out the absolute limits of the vehicle, as well as making sure we know how to smoothly control the vehicle as well. And I'm not quite sure we always go into the full aspects of that. We're talking about getting the car moving and stopping and all the rest of it, but are we doing it smoothly? Do we know where the limits are? Invariably, we don't always, so that will be quite a useful thing to have a look at. We also, in the national standards, it talks about how to use the road according to the Highway Code. Highway Code is a great book. The difficulty is it is down to interpretation, but we do need to understand that book first of all, and then learn how to interpret it. So yeah, a useful part of the process. How much training do we really receive on that? Is it self-training, and how much quality is it? Another subject maybe for a different day. But then we've also got knowing how to drive safely, responsibly, leaving space and avoiding incidents, and that's on manage incidents, and that's the driving aspect on level 4. And then on level 5 is adjust and review driving behaviour throughout your driving career, which again it's all about self-development, self-learning, and continuing to do that throughout your driving career or riding career. I thought the references are great. There's some really good references. I've had a look at some of the research in that. I know a lot of it already, but there's some great research in the back there. Again, it all seems research down to driving, and although that's obviously relevant for the book, there is some great research on motorcycling, but also against other psychological factors that can be brought into the driving task, which cognitive biases apply to almost everything we do, including the driving and riding and pedestrian task, if you like. So I'm always surprised by these things that although that's traditional, maybe that you apply the research based upon the subject area. Why not integrate some of the other things as well? So, but really good research even so. So some really good stuff inside there. Again, I sort of researched some of that stuff and had a read through some of the things that I hadn't seen before. But fantastic book. It's recommended, but I think that it could have gone a lot further. I think it feels like it's been... There's something missing from it. I can't quite put my finger on it. There's some passion or drive missing from the book, and I think that's possibly because it is a government book. It had to be well vetted and maybe edited down in that way. Why? Let's make it interesting, this stuff. It doesn't sound interesting, but for me it is, because it's surrounding driving and road safety, and that's some of my passion. So it possibly could be a little bit more engaging, a little bit more interesting, and I know that's not deliberately what it's meant for. And again, I think a lot of this needs to be integrated into Highway Code. I think it needs to be interested into things like Essential Skills, which is another book by TSO as well. So good book, certainly worth a read, great for instructors, and it's a lot. The discussions that we should be having possibly as driving instructors are very much some of the discussion that's inside the book, especially around driving behaviours and how we manage frustrating situations and things and changes in our life. Again, very much surrounding the GDE matrix, goals for driver education. So anyway, I think it is a very good book, certainly worth a read. There are some changes I would like to make to it, but I've put it out there already. But certainly worth a read. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe. I feel free to put comments below. Some of the things I suggested might be a little bit controversial, and that's absolutely fine. Always interested in hearing your feedback. Apart from that, listen out for more videos shortly, and thanks for listening. Thank you.